talking about a few different things today. A few different things in mind, but you know what? We have one main focus that we're going to look at all of our topics. This is the separation of church and state. Now, I know it's a big issue. It always has been in the past, and it still will be in the future. And it's one of those things that our country needs to learn from the past in order to prepare for in the future. How do we separate the ideas of God and religion from ideas of the state, which are hardcore ideas that should or shouldn't be centered around the ideas of the church? After all, does everybody believe the same thing? In these next few segments, we're going to take a look at the different ways that church and state have been involved with each other in the past, and then hopefully we'll be able to learn from that in the future.
I'm so glad you came to listen to my little story today. I am going to tell you of the time how I grew up through the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials. Through this, the majority of practicing Christians and other religions believed that the devil could give loyal worshippers, which they called witches, power to harm in return to his loyalty. In January of 1692, when I was a mere 10-year-old, Salem's reverend's daughters and niece started having fits, and then another girl joined this list of accusers. These fits, they consisted of screaming, convulsing, throwing things, and making peculiar sounds and noises. The doctors, which went to go check on the girls, blamed the supernatural. The girls, well, they blamed 3 women for being witches and tormenting them with sinister spells. These 3 women were interrogated and sent to jail for being accused by these 3 young girls. One of the ladies who was accused confessed working with the devil, which sent Salem town into chaos. Soon, church leaders were accused by people, meaning that if church leaders were working for the devils, then anyone could be. Dozens more were accused, and the first one hanged was Bridget Bishop on June 10, 1693. The respected Minister Cotton wrote a letter asking why the court was sending people to jail based on what other people felt and saw. There was no real evidence involved in sending innocent people to jail and killing them. A little while later, Governor Phipps disbanded the use of spectral evidence, the testimony against someone using just dreams and visions. Now, all the testimonies had to be backed up by true, hard evidence, because evidence that can only be seen by the person afflicted is not legitimate. The government was affected forever because the Christian beliefs of witchcraft brought about the disbandment of spectral evidence in all courts forever.
Hello, and welcome to U.S. History 1. So, Andrew, today we're going to be learning about slavery and church involvement in slavery. So, the church was one of the largest things that connected the North and the South, but it was also one of the largest things that disconnected the North and the South because of the different views on how the church should be involved in slavery. So, the Presbyterians and the Christians thought of slavery as a sin because it was using, it was taking God's children and having them be put above other children. Well, we're all children of God and we should all be equal. It was violating the natural right of man to enslave one to another. It is impossible to separate church and state because church will always involve itself in things that it sees necessary. So the politicians would say, well, you're the church, you have no right to involve yourself in our state matters because we're the state and we can make our own decisions, we shouldn't be mixed. But the church would fire back and say, well, it becomes our duty to rebuke you when it involves the well-being of other people. And slavery is, we're all under God, we're all saying that the church has the duty to help the black people who were enslaved to the white people. And the well-being of human is being comprised when it's the church's best interest to intervene and help. And so one of the stories was the story of Ham. He was from the Old Testament. So white slaveholders in the South believed in the curse of Ham, was to give rise to the fact that slavery is natural because the descendants of Ham were supposed to be cursed, which includes black people. They were the descendants of Ham, so they believed that slavery was natural because it was done back in the Old Testament, which is also, that's giving power to the Bible because they're taking the Bible story and giving reasons for slavery, which is wrong because God does not go with slavery. So, do you have any questions about today? No? Okay, thank you.
Oh, hi. So I'm working on a history project here, and I have some quotes, and I've got some great analysis written down, but I need a little help sorting out my thoughts, so I was wondering if you could give me a hand.
No problem at all. Let me take a look.
There you go.
Well, We really are going to look at these quotes here, analyze them nice and slowly so that we really can understand the magnitude and the depth of what this is trying to tell us. Let's take a look at the first one. The purpose of separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries. Now that quote was said by James Madison in 1803. So the first thing we need to keep in mind is the time period and the context in which this was stated. So we can see here that glimpses of ideas on the separation of church and state are just starting to come arise, and people are starting to be aware. After all, being aware is essentially what creates change here in the United States. So what James Madison is really trying to say here is that it is important to keep church and state separate from each other, because when you start combining things, you can't force everyone to believe the same thing. For example, it is like we take a metaphysics class instead of simply a religion class. It's understanding the difference between the two so we can analyze and synthesize with everybody understanding. Now, they want to keep from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe. Basically, he's saying here that in combining church and state, it has caused many wars and many innocent lives have been taken because of this.
Hello. Today, I'm annotating and thinking about the Declaration of Independence and how it references God, our Creator, 5 times. Now, James Madison and George Washington say in many quotes that they believe that they created this government not mixing God and not mixing church and state. But it references God 5 times, and this is like one of the founding documents of our country, so how does that make sense? Well, it says, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protective of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." This section of the declaration above is asking God for his divine protection in this new country of the United States. Well, how can we ask the founding fathers, ask God for protection on a government that we claim where state and church don't mix? So yes, this is the universal God. It's not referencing Christianity or any particular religion. It's referencing God. And it says that, but our church, which is God, and our state don't mix, but they're asking God to help us with this new government. And it again references our God-given rights. Well, how does slavery follow giving human beings their God-given rights in this free country? And the purpose of the government was to fulfill our God-given rights, but just in that conclusion alone, church and state are mixing. They can't tell us that we have God-given rights without mixing our state and our church, because it's inevitable to mix the two, as stated in the Declaration of Independence.
It is the year of 1830, the year of the Indian Removal Act. Our President, Andrew Jackson, signed a bill as a law that Americans had the right to forcefully take our land, our Native American land, for their own. The white men taking our land are very land greedy, and that's the motive for this law, to kick us out of our home. This law underwent many courts in which we prayed very hard that this law wouldn't be passed, but it went through many courts and Congress meetings, and it was finally passed by Andrew Jackson. His hate for us from the past. The natives, us, we've been exited from our homes, and we're right now taking the path of the Trail of Tears. So many deaths have been rendered so far, and it's extremely dangerous because we don't get much rest, food, there's disease, we don't know what this path has ahead of us. It's extremely dangerous, in which most of us will probably die. At the end of this removal, we are going to be mandated to take up the Christian teachings. Luckily for us, though, they're very similar to our teachings that we already live. Our cultural teachings. We're allowed to keep our culture, but we still have to take up the Christian religion. It's a law that we have to convert and be open to these Christian teachings, but we can still be natives at the same time. Now, thinking, the state and the church mix very clearly here because the state made a law forcing this church upon us, which we don't see as fair considering we've been kicked out of our homes.
So, as seen by the events above that we have learned, it is quite inevitable to separate church and state, as we already saw. The intentions of not mixing them make sense, of course. I mean, trying to keep both pure, because it's not to base one government off in a religion, because there's so many religions and so many types of governments that it'd be confusing to mix them all. State choices affect the church, and the church will intervene into state decisions if they feel it necessary. So, basically, one will always affect the other. So even though the Founding Fathers did not intend it, church and state will always somehow be mixed.